Welcome to Pisic and to my review of the long anticipated Halide Mk II. I don't know about you, but whenever I think of Mark II, I always think of the Canon 5D Mark II. And you know what? I've tried to come to the Lake District to film this video for you, but it's so wet, you know, this just isn't working for me. 1 second. Okay, it's not the Lake District, but at least it's dry. So anyway, what was I saying? Mark II. So whenever I see the term Mark II, I always think of the Canon 5D Mark II. And with that, I want to wind the clock back to 2005 and the original Canon 5D, because with that camera, Canon brought full frame DSLR photography down from the upper echelons and made it accessible to the masses for the first time. Fast forward to 2017 and the original Halide was doing something extremely similar in the world of advanced camera apps. You see, the original Halide, with its stripped back design and its gesture-based control system being extremely similar to the iPhone's built-in camera app, Halide introduced advanced features like manual controls, raw shooting and white balance to a much wider iPhone user base for the first time, and it really opened the door for those who had previously found advanced camera apps to be too complicated. And just like that, developers Lux Optics managed to pull off a trick that many couldn't do back then and still can't do today, and that is make an advanced camera app that is both a fantastic introduction to beginners and somewhere that pros feel at home as well. And now Lux are back with Halide Mk II. And with such a wide breadth of Halide users, a sequel was never going to be easy. So have they pulled it off? In a word, yes. In my review of the original Halide, I said Halide doesn't look like an advanced camera app. It looks better. Halide Mk II looks like Halide, but better. The way the elements follow the curves of the iPhone and hug the edges just naturally builds on the original Halide aesthetic and makes Mark II the most beautiful camera app around. Now this is a problem because it's distractingly beautiful. I mean, sometimes I just want to look at the interface instead of taking photos with it. As well as looking better than the original, Mark II also works better as well, in most places anyway. The good news is the quick bar and the gesture-based system for changing exposure are both still here, but both have been revamped. Now this is great news for those coming from iPhone's built-in camera app for the first time, as they'll be able to pick everything up really quickly, and current users will feel right at home as well. And speaking of feeling at home, the main improvement to the quick bar is something that all iPhone users will be familiar with, and that is Jiggle mode. Just open the quick bar and tap and hold on the icons to enable Jiggle mode. And now you can move the icons around however you like. The biggest thing for current users to get used to is how the manual controls are now accessed by swiping from here when you're in portrait mode and from here when you're in landscape. Now this is less convenient than before, but Lux say that they've moved the manual controls out of the quick bar, out of that primary thumb zone, and over to the side, off to the side where it's less convenient, because auto exposure technology has improved so much. They think people will be accessing the manual controls less and less. More on the manual controls a little bit later on. Right now I want to focus on beginners, because Lux have really doubled down on not only making their app really easy to pick up, but also on helping those new to photography take the best pictures they can and learn. You get a subtle description of what you just tapped on to help you learn the names of things. So now when your picture turns all green, you know that's called focus peaking. One of the standout new features designed to help beginners is called Instant RAW. Now, Instant RAW is basically just Halide making some neutral tweaks to your RAW files, so those who haven't yet learned photo editing can shoot in RAW and enjoy the quality of the RAW files without them looking like, well, RAW files. The developers' looks say that Instant RAW was mainly implemented for those users who want to shoot in RAW, have tried it, saw the RAW files look like garbage, didn't know what to do, and then gave up. So if that sounds like you, number one, don't worry, because we've all been there, and number two, then you should enjoy this because Instant RAW actually works in most situations. Now, something that I found really useful when I first started shooting in RAW many years ago was shooting in both RAW and JPEG. I would use the JPEGs, but I would keep the RAW files for practice and to go back to when I was more confident with editing. Now, you can of course shoot in both RAW and JPEG in many different camera apps, but the iPhone isn't powerful enough to apply things like HDR3 and Deep Fusion when you do so. So it compromises by turning those things off, which can result in your JPEG files looking, well, worse than what you're used to. With Halide Mk II though, for the very first time you get the best of both, thanks to a feature they call coverage. Take a look at this RAW plus JPEG example from ProCamera. You can see that the highlights in the wall have just completely burned out. You can't see any detail whatsoever. Now take a look at this example from Halide Mk II, and you can see because Halide Mk II's JPEG has still had access to HDR3, all the detail in the wall is now visible. So what about the more manually inclined amongst us? Well, for the more traditional photographers like myself, who just want to shoot mainly in manual mode and then collect a plain old RAW file at the end of it, you can of course just ignore coverage and Instant RAW and pretend like they don't exist, which is what I do, to be honest. I just want to dial in my settings as quickly and as accurately as possible and then, like I said, collect my RAW file. So from a speed and efficiency and a convenience perspective, the worst part about the manual controls is actually having to switch from auto to manual, which you have to do every time you open the app, as it opens in auto. And if you have a full screen iPhone with regular sized hands, as I do, then you have to do this two-handed, which does downgrade Halide's reputation as a one-handed wonder, but to be honest, it's not that big of a deal. Once you have activated manual mode though, it will stay in manual mode as long as the app is open, and the controls themselves have been improved. They're displayed larger and get a permanent place either side of the notch, which is nice. But obviously if you're using an iPhone without a notch, then this will look different for you. Regardless of which iPhone you have though, the actual values themselves are separated into really small intervals, so you can be extremely precise with your settings. And that's what Halide Mk II is all about for manual shooters: precision. Everything here is designed to help you be as precise as possible and to help you achieve the most optimum focus and exposure. To this end, there are two types of histogram, luminance and RGB. You also get a color waveform, which I believe is a first in any stills app. And you have RGB zebras, which again, I haven't seen in a stills app before. In typical Halide fashion, they all stay out of the way until you need them. And with the histograms and the waveform, you get two different views. You get one that's nice and big, front and center, so you can really analyze what you're doing, or you can send them off into the corner when you really need to concentrate on your composition and your focus. And don't worry if you're looking at any of these features and scratching your head, because Halide has its own tutorials built in, and you can sign up to have lessons emailed to you as well. Halide Mk II also has features for precise manual focusing as well. You've already had a glimpse of the extremely comprehensive and bright peaking, and there's also a new loop feature which I've been using a lot and I find it extremely helpful. And finally, bringing it all together is something that again I believe is a first and only for Halide Mk II, and that is real-time 14-bit RAW visualization. Now Dave, what the hell is real-time 14-bit RAW visualization? Well, this is 8-bit and this is 14-bit. RAW files are 14-bit, but when you're shooting, your iPhone can't display all 14 bits of information. It can only display 8 bits. This means when you're shooting and when you're choosing your exposure guides like the histogram and your zebras are lying to you because they don't have access to all of the tonal information coming into the sensor. Take a look at this example. This is ProCam 7, and at these settings the zebras are telling me parts of the photo, those bits in the leaves, are clipping, which means losing information. The same thing with the Moment app at the same settings. But you'll see when we take the photo, it's actually not clipped at all. Now this is the problem with 8-bit previews, and you can see how this would affect your photography. But because Halide Mk II can analyze the scene in all 14 bits, it knows there's actually data there and we don't get that clipping warning. If you're shooting a landscape, for example, and you think that the clouds are blown out, so you adjust your settings when you don't need to, then it could end up giving you more work to do when editing later, or could even ruin your photo completely. And because this feature is so resource intensive, it's not on all the time. It only activates when you're actively adjusting the ISO or the shutter speed. So there's clearly a lot going on under the hood in Halide Mk II for all of this to work, but somewhere where there's not a lot going on is in the settings, which I'm perfectly fine with. The one thing I will point out though is this Stop Facebook Spying feature. This removes your location data when you share your photos to any Facebook owned app, so that includes Facebook itself, WhatsApp and Instagram. LuxOptics then really seems to care about its users' privacy. But just because they care and they seem like cool people doesn't mean I'm not going to mention the issues in Halide Mk II, starting with stability. Now, like I said before, Halide Mk II has a ton, it must have a ton going on under the hood to get all of its new features to work. But despite all of this extra complexity, it has been, in my experience, a lot more stable than the original, which was prone to crashing multiple times per day. Whereas Halide Mk II, again, in my experience, I've only found it's crashed and shown errors a couple of times, which means it's still not perfect, but it's at least an improvement. Next is the placement of the manual controls. Now, I did say before that it's not a big deal that they've been relegated off to the side, but as you can see, there is space here in the quick bar, 2 spaces in fact, where auto and manual could go. So instead of having them over here, I'd like to move the auto and manual switcher back down into the quick bar for more convenient activation. And finally, as well as crashing, something else the original would do as well is reset your ISO and shutter speed every single time you tapped to focus in manual mode, which was very annoying, and Halide Mk II does it too. The white balance is also the same as the original as well. You get a few presets and that's it, no Kelvin. However, one of the developers was on Reddit doing an AMA, so I asked him about the white balance and the tap to focus thing, and he said in a future update there will be grey card white balance and Halide will stop overriding your manual settings when you tap to focus. So happy days. Something else that the developer mentioned on the AMA was the new pricing model. Now, I know that you guys have been really keen to hear my thoughts on Halide Mk II's pricing model, and I've not mentioned it until now because as soon as I mention that something is a subscription, you click off the video and you stop watching. So people seem to really despise subscription models. So before I give you my opinion, let me lay out Halide Mk II's new pricing model. So if you are a current Halide user, then you can still use the app for free for 1 year, and then after that year is over, you then have a choice. You can pay $11.99 per year to keep receiving updates, or you can buy the app outright for $36. And if you do nothing, then you can still use the app, but you will not receive any more updates. For new users, you get a 1-week free trial, and then you have the same choice, $11.99 a year, or you can buy the app outright for $36. And I'm speaking in dollars because the overwhelming majority of my audience are American. Howdy. So what do I think of this? Well, I have a lot of thoughts and I wrote them down, so I'm going to read off of my iPad what I wrote down. So I can see both sides. Most consumers these days, they're up to their eyeballs in monthly payments. Like they've got their Netflix, they've got their mobile phone, their car, their house even, you go Amazon Prime, Adobe Creative Cloud, etc. And the last thing that they want, especially now, is another monthly payment. I feel you, I understand. But the positive is that current users still get to use the app for free for 1 year with updates. And then after that 1 year is over, the updates will stop. But as far as I understand it, you can still use the app. It just won't be updated. So that means it will eventually stop working. Now, Halide is $11.99 a year, not a month, a year. So that's 99 cents a month. So the next time you go into that Starbucks or that coffee shop, whichever one it is, you could be spending a year's worth of Halide in there on 2 cups of coffee and a cake. Now, in terms of making a one-off payment, Halide at $36 is eons more expensive at the time of recording anyway than other popular advanced camera apps. Just to name a few, you've got the Moment app at $6.99 currently, you've got ProCam 7 at $7.99 and ProCamera at $8.99. Just know that some of these other apps like ProCam 7, ProCamera and Moment will probably implement their own versions of Halide Mk II's new features, and I'm willing to bet they'll also follow Halide Mk II's pricing model as well. You see, when I wound the clock back to 2005 at the start of this video, I didn't tell you the full story. You see, 3 years after the original 5D, Canon released the 5D Mark II. And with that camera, DSLRs stepped out of the primordial soup for the first time. Canon leapfrogged the competition and made a camera that laid the foundations and set the path for digital SLRs for the next 10 years. And now, 3 years after the original Halide, Lux have released Halide Mark II, and I think you know what I'm getting at here, because despite all of its flaws, and yes, there are quite a few at this moment in time, I think Halide Mark II will be a game changer. I think it'll be successful, and I think it has laid the path that others will follow. So if you've enjoyed this review, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for $9.99 a year. No, I'm just joking. It is, of course, free. Seriously, leave a comment letting me know what you think. Even if your comment is negative, even if you disagree with everything I've said, and you absolutely hate my guts, you hate the sight of my face, you hate my little cat here in the background, and you hate the fact that I have another cat over there, tell me how much you hate these things. Let's have a discussion about it. And in the meantime, that is my review of Halide Mark II. Thank you so much for watching. Seriously, take care, stay curious, and because it is now nighttime, nabdibuna. The way the elements follow the curves of the iPhone and hug the edges naturally builds on Halide's aesthetic and makes Mark II. Oh, does anyone have an anti-aircraft gun? I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding. I'm not a murderer, nor do I have murderous tendencies. It's just, you know. Come fly with me, let's fly away. Pisic is recording a review, and we'll fly over him. Okay.